my courtesies of the time, it's very proper that when people are gracious enough to come visit me, that we should always present some sort of gift to them, be it a song, a story, something to thank you for your time and attention. I'm so very glad that you're here. I'm Dr. Franklin Benedict.
How do you do?
I'm most well, thank you. And so we will begin in just a few moments. We hope that you have a wonderful time with this entire escapade, and I do appreciate your attendance on this evening. When I was in France at the latter part of my life, Asians of the newly formed United States illegally done with no other cause but our own decisions to make a statement, much like a young boy running away from home. There were several agents there, agents of wisdom, agents of thought. One of them was Madame Brillon. Madame Brillon de Joy. And she was a brilliant mind, quite a facilitator to help introduce me to the intellectuals of Paris and of all of France and the ministers. And she was also quite a musician. So as a true gift to welcome you here, we have a composition done by Madame Brillon, sung this evening by the wonderful operatic soprano Eleanor Stallcop-Horrox, who has come all the way here from the far side of the oceans to sing you one of her compositions written for myself. Madame.
Je
one and all. My name is Gilad Paz, and I'm a multi-genre vocalist and producer, as well as a performer in bossa nova, opera, TLV, and others. It is my pleasure to introduce an individual who was and is many things to his time and to ours. A printer, writer, businessman, innovator, athlete, military commander, civic leader, a world-famous scientist, philosopher, arithmetician, statesman, ambassador, an inventor who snatched the lightning from the heavens and the scepter from tyrants, and much, much more. A man with only 2 years of formal education, a runaway, an owner of servants, and a contract brief, a plagiarist, and, depending on your point of view, a cad, rebel, womanizer, and traitor. A man who witnessed most of the 18th century, a time of discovery, change, and intrigue, and a man who helped bring about that change. From a time of kings to that of presidents, from superstition to science, aristocracy to republicanism, one man saw it from start to new birth. That man is our guest tonight. A Renaissance man, a man of the Enlightenment, presenting a lecture on his life, followed by questions from you to him, and then to the presenter. It is my great honor to introduce Dr. Benjamin Franklin!
Merci beaucoup. It is a marvelous thing of nature, is it not, how perfect things become, sometimes all on their own. Notice, for example, when I want to take a drink, the arm is so constructed, the elbow perfectly located, that when I raise the glass, it comes to my lips. Imagine if the elbow was here or here. It would make this very difficult. In America, I said, beer is proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy. In France, I said, it was wine. I don't think there's a competition. But as I look at the glass, as wonderful as it is and how much happiness it can bring to us in moderation, I also note its fragility. It can hold much. Celebrations and toasts to all things that we have an occurrence upon the year, holidays and days to celebrate weddings, to toast those who have gone before. And yet how fragile it is. If it drops, it breaks. It can never really be put back together again. I oftentimes compared the British Empire, including we colonists and the colonies themselves, as being a china vase, something that if it is dropped and fractured, it will never be knitted again. No adhesive, no glues could be able to bring its form back to such perfection. It is beautiful beyond count. In reckoning, the amount of labor that goes into the construction is considerable and takes the talent of thousands, many generations to perfect. And yet once broken, what are you to do with it? Decide from an early age, I shall be a lawyer, and I shall speak in defense of those who are defenseless. Or I shall be a military person and take my ship and my cannons, and I shall go defend and bring forth justice and bring forth the might of the British Empire, say, to the New World or to other parts of the Old World. People who are poets decide to write or not write. Shakespeare and others all bring to the fore their decisions, and one person hires or buys a ticket, one person does not. It is like a roll of a large and constant set of dice that determines ourselves, it seems, and yet we can self-determine as well. We make the decisions of how we shall proceed or not, and how we determine, how we interpret the forces beyond ourselves. Now, of course, this is an old man's rambling. When I was a child, I did not understand how the world worked, but I knew that I had several interests that I could apply to. I knew that, for example, I loved to read, and I loved to write. And I loved, from an early age, from the time of 3 years on, to read, and I could not remember a time I could not read. And so I applied myself to everything that I could get my hands on. Now, I came from a fairly large family. Indeed, my father had 17 children. Now, mind you, I was the 15th child, the 10th son. And so there are many of my elder brothers and sisters who I barely knew because they had grown up, been married, found a profession, and moved on with their lives. I remember, I think at most, 13 people at our table, dining in Boston, where I was born. And there it was held that as our country grew, that I should be able, and I should have a need to finding my place in it. And one of the things that put me in very good stead was a habit that my father had at his table, that even though he was a poor man, he was considered a very wise one. And no one could walk into our town of Boston and be excused from our table should they have an interest. It could be a preacher. It could be a sailor, a captain, a postal worker. It could be whoever. And if they were interested in a good, solid, homely meal with simple accoutrement, then they would be welcome at our table, provided they tell us their story. And so we, as young children, were promised that if we behaved, we could sit at table and even, perchance, ask some questions of these far-off travelers and learn about the wider world that we had not seen yet. Why, indeed, we learned about not only Boston, but also all of New England, and down the coast to the other colonies, and to wherever the ships that sailed to. Of course, our homeland, where our great King George lived, Britain, England, London, and then across Europe, to the Russias, and the German provinces, and of course France, and even as far away as Cathay, called China. Indeed, some sailors passed through that had traveled to that far and distant strange land and told us tales. And my curiosity began to soar like the very kite that I loved to fly as a child. And I began to read everything I could put my hands on. And my father, thinking that because I loved to read so much, and perchance I might become a scholar, put me into the Latin school locally there in Boston. And it was there that it was determined that since I was his 10th son, that I would become a tithe to the Presbyterian Church and become a preacher. Several things, though, provided that that did not happen. One is I questioned things more than accepted things. Two, I would do things like when we were at home, and my father would be pickling and salting all the provisions for the winter. I suggested that rather than wasting the time at a prayer before every meal, we say one prayer now over all of it and be done. How much more efficient would that be, Father? Perchance I wasn't meant for the clergy, he thought. And so he put out me to apprentice at several different positions, trying to find the one that I liked. And my father's profession was hunter. He was trained as silk dyer in England, for my father was born in England and came over here with his wife and child. And Elizabeth, Samuel, and Hannah, all born in Branbury. And then he set up in Boston. Now, there is, I don't know if you know much about Boston, but they don't have much business doing with dyed silks. They're a very hard-scrabble country. And so he looked for the one profession that might be less desirable for the common housewife to do. Something that perchance had the smell to it, or the labor was too intense. And he found tallow making of candles, as the term using the name chandler, and also a soap boiler. Then my task was, as a young boy, to assist in the making of candles. You make candles from tallow. You get tallow by boiling the hides of animals that come from the slaughterhouse and the butchers. And let me tell you, it's good work, it's noble work, and it's stinky work. And as most people did in our time, they would live above their shops. And so all those fumes wafted their way up into the air to where we lived and where I slept, and I did not want to be a candle maker. Plus, the intellectual stimulation of making candles was rather plain and unadorned, and I strove for something more. I love the sea. I've always loved the water, swimming in it, which was unusual in my time, as well as all, of course, living in Boston. You look out at the harbor, and then you see nothing but ship's masts as thick as a forest's trees. And I wanted to go to sail, but my father, having lost one son to the sea, we don't know what happened to him ever. That he took a sailor's life, and we never saw him again, really. He was not eager for me to follow that profession. And so I was put out at other things. Sent to one of my elder brothers to learn the craft of cutlery and how to make knives and such. The Franklins were, by tradition, freemen, meaning that we were never serfs, but we were blacksmiths, a great many of our forefathers. And so metalwork was in our blood. And to that point, I didn't take well to that, and my brother wanted too much for my apprenticeship, and so he put me into a glazier shop, which is how you make glass. And that wouldn't go so well, but I learned from all of these things, and to a jeweler's shop, and to a bricklayer shop, and eventually my brother having James, he recently returning from England, where he did the normal apprenticeship of 7 years, learning the art of a printer. And because of my love of reading, from a young age, now in my early teens, he put me there as a journeyman pressman. Now, as I was young, I learned from him, but I learned quickly, as I did from all those other ones. I've never had a piece of information fall into my mind that I did not find some use for later. Indeed, my short practice with a jeweler, when one of my other elder brothers had a blockage, and if your ladies will please excuse me, in the letting of water tracks of himself, he got blocked, and there was no way of releasing the pressure. And so through my brief study with those various things, I understood that how the path worked, having read some books on the anatomy of man, and I designed a flexible catheter that a jeweler was able to make and inserted, I won't go any further, and up the channel of the river it was pressed and was able to relieve my brother's pain and saved his life. And here I was, but a young boy. But it was that type of mixing of knowledge from many sources, which is, of course, a great calling of the Renaissance, where you bring together knowledge from all different sources. You don't just specialize. You learn a bit about everything. And the Enlightenment, to take part in art is one of its main callings, to learn a little bit about everything, farming and painting and playing the fiddle or the penny whistle or other things. You want to learn as much as you can about as many different things, not to necessarily master them, but to have an understanding of them. So as you scratch your violin, when you hear a fine violinist, or when you sing passively and you hear a fine vocalist, you appreciate their attention to detail and the dedication to the craft. Grow a tomato plant, and then appreciate the farmer. But so I was sent to a pressman. And I grew up, and I was rather cheeky. I soon grew to be larger than my brother. I was stronger than him. I was a faster print setter. And I could carry 2 full trays of lead type up and down stairs, where most of the workmen could only carry 1. I never liked the arbitrary use of power, and my brother helped to forge that into me all the more. He struck me often, he beat me when I was cheeky and irreverent, which was often, and I think that is what set my mind against arbitrary use of power, which you will see, if you know anything about my life, comes up later as well. But we did do things together. My brother, having many arguments with the administration of the town of Boston, the government and the assembly, wrote many scurrilous pieces against them. And it was there that they took the trouble that they actually imprisoned him for being that troublesome. And when he was in prison, I was set to be the new editor and publisher of the New England Courant. Now, I had signed articles of indenturement with my brother, which means that anything that I did was technically underneath his command. So even with my name on the masthead, the top of the newspaper, that I would still be able to be blamed for doing the work of my master. And so he freed me from my indentured servitude, but wrote new articles on the back, but they could not be published because that would indicate that the articles had been falsely released. And so I took advantage of that. And one of the things that I did once he was released is I began, because of this weight of oppression that I felt from him, to write letters to his publication, disguised my hand, and gave myself a new name, Silence Dogood. And it was that I began writing articles criticizing Harvard as being a great manufacturer of men who had no use whatsoever except to be able to walk into a room very well, be able to stand and point, and to be able to dance. But other than that, they were nothing but more than blockheads. And other parts, and she would complain, and me writing in that voice. And my brother did not know who did the writing. And I had great pleasure as I was working the press to hear he and his friends decide which of the luminaries of the town might be the author of these little missives. And after a while, I revealed myself, which his friends thought were very, very amusing. He did not. And he struck me again. And so I was beginning to build like a pot of steam to the boiling point. I was frozen in place with the hidden articles of indenturement, but knew that he could not press them too much, and so I simply, something I do not recommend to you young people now, I ran away. I had my friend tell a ship's captain that I'd gotten a naughty girl in trouble, and so sold a few of my books, which I had got, and stole on ship, and went, oh, is this a familiar story to you? Goliath. Well, so I went to New York and looked for work as a pressman. There being none there, was recommended by one Bradford there to Philadelphia, which I had never been to. I had never left Boston before that. And so in Philadelphia, I arrived, and after sailing and rowing for several days, and not having my better clothes brought along yet, I walked through the streets of Philadelphia with my pockets turned out with my socks and stockings and my extra shirts. And back then, there was no common currency, and so I had a few Dutch dollars, I had a few coppers, and so eventually discussing with a baker, because I was mighty hungry, how much I could buy for bread, and he didn't understand my money, and I barely understood his accent, and so we finally settled how much bread for those pennies, and he gave me 3 puffy rolls. I put one underneath each arm and one stuffing my face, and as I was walking down the streets of Philadelphia, I passed by a stoop, somewhat like a small porch, and there was a young woman, very comely, who looked at me and laughed at me because she must have thought that I looked, as I certainly did, most ridiculous and most silly. I did not realize later that that woman would one day become my common-law wife, Deborah. But again, the turn of a card, the roll of a dice, how was I to know? But I did get work with one Keimer, a very disheveled publisher who had a broken set of type and a barely working press, but I, being somewhat handy with mechanical devices, was able to set it up, and we were able to push on with our publication. And again, I was quick, and so he gave me the better jobs, the more, I think the term would be, rush jobs. And from that, I was able to establish myself as a proper printer's apprentice. Eventually, my family got to know where I was and that I hadn't simply died. But my writing of the letters, when Holmes, Captain Holmes, who was a brother-in-law to husband of one of my sisters, took the letter, and as was oftentimes done, you shared letters that you got, and certainly the post office would do this as well. They would open up almost every letter and copy the news from it, and then show it amongst other people. So my brother-in-law Holmes the Captain Holmes, shared it with the then governor of Pennsylvania, one Sir William Keith. And he was impressed with my writing, and not very impressed with the local newspapers or the local people taking notes at the assembly, and came to me and said, young Franklin, now imagine this, Keimer, being this sort that was somewhat pinched nose and very, very particular and not very generous or kind, the governor of Pennsylvania comes to his door. So quickly tries to smooth his out-of-sort hair and pluck his nose hairs or whatever he was doing and try and make himself presentable. And the governor and his good friend, the colonel, walk in past him and simply say, "Where's young Franklin?" Keimer looked like a poisoned pig. But he'd introduced me, and then they took me away for a glass of Madeira and told me that, "Young Franklin, this town needs a good printer, and we must send you to England to be able to buy a good press and good type and come back and we will give you all of our business from the assembly and other products that we need to print and have copied." And so with this advice, and here I was, an older teen still, thinking myself quite full of myself, decided to take him up on this. And so I booked passage upon a ship to England, our capital, London. And there, and when I arrived, I looked for the letters of introduction that Keith had promised. I looked for the letters of credit that the governor had promised. Finding neither, a very kind Quaker who I befriended on the long trip over, one Denham, said, "Oh, young Franklin, if I had known whose banking of credit and credulity you are assuming, I would have warned you that Governor Keith has no money to give credit. He has no friends to give recommendation or introduction by. The only thing that he has to give is expectations. Have you ever tried to eat an expectation?" And so I was stranded in London. Now, I mentioned young Deborah. We had grown to be quite an acquaintance. I was rooming in her father's house, and we had become engaged of sorts before I left. This was one of the great errata of my life. Great mistakes. Errata is a printing term. And it was there that I wrote her only once in my 18 months that I was in London, telling her that I should not be traveling home again soon, not knowing when I would return. Because I was still a printer, I was able to get work at Watley's and other print shops in London, which put me in touch with all sorts of publications, newsletters, private notes, diaries of sorts, and newspapers from other lands, translations, etc., and beginning to get a hand with how to understand and translate Spanish and French and German and some of the other languages. And I rubbed along fairly well. Was not able to save a great deal of money because my friend James Ralph, who accompanied me, was quite the reprobate, and he loved theater and drinking and women, and I soon fell in with his ways and was not able to save much money. But after 18 months, even though I was there in the land of Shakespeare, of Strongbow, of Chaucer, I almost met Sir Newton, and was able to sell some curiosities to a few other inventors, but it got to taste of the glory that was the British Empire. And there, though, even despite I was there in the center of all the culture that I knew and loved, after 18 months I grew wary, and young good Mr. Denham, good Quaker Denham, was going back to the colonies to set up as a mercantile, and so hired me and paid my voyage to be his assistant. And so we traveled back. And it was there that I would find myself at a loss. I was at one of those turning points, you see. One of the things I wasn't certain what decisions I should make. Denham I could trust. And I knew that becoming a mercantile's assistant would be a good move. But what was I to do with my life? What was I to dedicate myself to? What was I to do to make a difference? Not just to earn money, but to earn my keep. To pay back, as it were, the great gift of life that I'd been given by whatever providence there was. And so I made a little list of the things that I should try and do to perfect my nature, finding great fault in things, not being well ordered. Was I too much of a gossip? Was I excessive in drink or eating? Was I using my charm improperly? was I dedicating myself enough to study, etc., and to learning the ways of science? And so I wrote this list and then promised myself that I would try and keep up with it and rotate the 13 principles that I eventually established with it, they being temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, and more. These are things which I found very useful to me and very useful to my attention to being useful. I was not in my elder years quite certain of the divinity of anyone's God. I simply felt God was a great purpose, a great clockmaker, who had turned the world into an order and then walked away to do other things. And that the only rule, the prime rule that this creature of great strength and amazing talent who created all that we could see asked of us is to do good to my fellow creature. And that is what I've tried to do. In all the things that I've done, in all the things that I did, that has been my one rule, to try and be of use. Now when we returned to Philadelphia, we rubbed along very well. I took orders, I went around, but we both fell ill, and he being much older, Quaker Denham passed away, sadly, and I was cast a lot. He left me a small remembrance, but I had to find a printer again. And so I worked for Keimer again for a while, but was eventually able, by being frugal, one of my 13 principles, by being frugal and not wasting money, able to set up my own shop. Now when I returned, my good Deborah was able to establish a friendship with me again. Now this again was partly my fault. She had been advised that I was probably not likely to return. And so, in a twist of one of those fates, one of those rolls of dice, she was convinced to marry a fellow by the name of John Rogers, who was a potter and a rotter. He was able to marry her, and then it was discovered that he was already married. This was a scandal, and she refused to cohabitate with him anymore and left him. Now here was the quandary. He ran off soon afterwards. We heard that he may have died in Barbados. We don't know. And once we began to set up our relationship again, if I married her legally, I would become responsible for his debts, which were several, he having spent her dowry already. If we married religiously, and Rogers were to turn up again, then she could be convicted of polyandry, which is severe whipping on bare backs and years in prison. And so we decided to simply set up as man and wife in a common law marriage. And I brought into the marriage my son, another errata. William, you see, was given birth by someone who I have never, ever once named. It was a woman, you may guess that. But it was not anyone of name. Possibly one of the low women that I used to frequent so much as a lusty young youth. Or possibly someone who I got in the way of child to convince their parents to give me more dowry. It is not known. But I promised whoever that I would raise the child as my own and preserve that secret. And so I did. Now, imagine newly married, or at least common law married, to a man who's one of the first things brings home for your celebration, gives you a child from another mother. And Deborah was not pleased, but was a good, faithful wife, a good workmate, and took William into her care. And from that, we started our family. Soon afterwards, a few years later, young Francis was born, the apple of everyone's eye. I was so proud of him. Frankie, we called him. And he was brilliant, a delightful young child. And we rubbed along very well. My wife worked so hard. She ran the shop. She ran the selling of soaps. She ran the stitching, the binding of all the different things that we were printing. And she took the money. She was very clever, very fast, and very accurate with her accounting, as many business women or wives of businessmen were to be, and actually fomented in my mind the desire to publish and to recommend that women be given more of an education than they were given at my time. We had much good time, but one of the things that began to turn my fortune greatly was we began printing an almanac. Now, almanacs were very common. Titan Leeds wrote one, Bradford created and printed an almanac, and they were basically the same amount of information. The tides, when to plant your season, some local news, important dates, etc., to remember the king's birthday and the queen's birthday, etc. But mine, because of course the months are not even, and so you have extra space sometimes in your calendar. And so I began to take well-known wise sayings and rewrite them and begin to put them in there, and quaint little stories here and there tucked into the magazine, which people seemed to give approbation for. Amongst little sayings such as, love thy neighbor, but don't tear down thy hedge. If there is marriage without love, there shall be love without marriage. Fish and visitors stink after 3 days. And this proved to make... See, still true. And so these things came to be associated with which of these various almanacs should we buy, and mine was preferred, selling up to 10,000 per year. People had in their houses normally at least 2 publications. 1, the King James Bible, and 2, my almanac. Normally you didn't have to buy more than 1 Bible, but every year you had to buy a new almanac. And after after almost two decades of this, I was able to retire at the early age of 40 and dedicate myself to that which I truly loved, the exploration of philosophy, what you would now call science. And I became to be attracted to the idea of electricity and what it was and what possibly its use could be. Now, I was always tinkering with things, mechanical and social. Now, I have shrunk a bit now from my lusty years, but I was almost 6 feet tall, well over 200 pounds. I could swim 4 miles at a time, lifting weights. Of course, working a press was very hard work, and I developed quite the physique. I always loved to swim, and I loved to play with nature. I flew a kite extensively as a young youngster, being able to strip, paying somebody a copper to take my clothes to the other side of the pond, and then let out a kite and let it pull me across as easily, without even a stroke, my arms. I was always looking for things to make things easier. You may even call me quite lazy. But I always broke things down into its constituent parts and then began to play with what if you replace this part, or this part, or this part? And how would you be able to improve it? A better way of arranging the typefaces, a better way of working the screw of the press, a better way of arranging the sails on a ship or the loading of their cargo. Everything can be broken down into its constituent parts and then replaced piece by piece until you find the best way of doing something. Well, it was at this time when I was introduced to electrical experiments, which was the rage. Certainly, it is sometimes said that I invented electricity. This could not be further from the truth. But I did study it, and one of the great questions that we had was electricity, which we could produce by cranking a glass sphere in a woolen cloak around it, and that static electricity, something like this rug, if you scoot your feet around a rug and then touch a doorknob, you receive a shock. Do you not? Have you been experimenting? Good. Scientists, philosophers, you all. And this is something that can be duplicated and studied. And this is a basis of our philosophy, is to be able to examine and study, to write out, and then let what I think your term now is a peer review. Something that you would be able to now give to be able to establish a truth of it. Something that can be verified by many minds, by many hands, using the same basic rules to establish the truth of it. And so we began collecting information, I and other mathematical and electrical wizards. We began to find out some truths about it. And we noticed that several of the characteristics of electricity matched those of electricity, of lightning. And so imagine this, beginning to theorize that electricity and lightning were the same thing. Just one was much bigger than the other. We could poke holes in metal with electrical. They have both a snap, one of course louder. They have that smell of sulfur after they explode. And they both can start a fire. Now imagine this time in our world. Lightning was not nature. Lightning was punishment from the Almighty. If your house, sir, was struck by lightning and caught fire, Your community would watch it burn. For obviously you were a sinner and God was punishing you. Your house, madam, sadly, was living next to it. Your house next to his caught fire. We would come with our leather buckets and we would put... Oh. I pity you, madam. Then you, madam, you're there, and your house is next to his, and your house catches fire from his house. We will come with our leather buckets and set your fire out. We will help remove your furniture, because you just have the misfortune of living next to such a sinful man. Ridiculous!
Wait, he's not wrong.
Well, that may be, but lightning is non-judgmental. It was simply put forth that if lightning was proved as a natural occurrence, I mean, still true, made by the great maker, whoever that may be, but still a natural occurrence, then you have every right to have something on your roof to prevent its cause and its destructive force. Just like you have a roof to prevent rain or snow from falling down, or too much sun. No one bothers you for wearing a hat to keep the sun out of your eyes. So if we could prove that lightning and electricity were the same thing, but how to do it? We knew that tall things were struck by lightning, but unfortunately there were no tall steeples fully constructed yet in our area. Some trees were there, but we needed something, a way to get, we knew that the lightning was, or our electricity was attracted to pointy metal rods. So we simply had to get a metal rod up into the sky. You needed to put it on a tall roof. You needed to put it on a tall roof, or a tall weight, breaking it into its constituent parts. We need the metal rod up in the air. Well, you need to have a tall, no. You need to have it up in the air. How else could you get a needle up into the air besides putting it on a structure? Did I mention the kite? From an early time, I know the kite could be flying. And if you put the needle on top of the kite, fly the kite into the dark clouds, it didn't have to be a full storm, because we've theorized that the electrical fluid, as we called it, would indeed be able to flow, as it does in our experiments, down the rod of some sort, or a string. And that was the experiment that we conducted. And I, with my son, William, who was in his early 20s by that point, were able to construct a kite large enough to hold the iron needle and fly it in the storm. Now, many of you have asked me, oh, Dr. Franklin, you risked your life for us to help put forth the cause of philosophy and science. How brave of you, how brave of you. Thank you very much. We took precautions. We had a large block of wax that we could stand on. We knew that wax was a good insulator. The hemp line that was between the kite and down towards our hand was protected from us by a silk ribbon. Silk, we knew, was a good insulator. And the last thing that I did to make certain that I was safe is I handed the kite string to my son. Thank you. You'll be fine, son. And he was. No worries there. Do you feel picked on? I burnt down your house and now tried to electrocute you.
I don't know what I ever did to you.
No, nothing. It's because I love you. And so with the electrical fluid flowing down the hemp line that was getting wet with what rain there was, and beginning to stand up on end, as static does to all things, to hair and to the lining of a coat, etc., then we began to realize if we could capture that fluid into the Leyden jars we had, which are an early form of battery, and they can actually hold the charge a bit, and do the same experiments that we could do with the electrical charge in our glass laboratories, then we would have an indication that indeed lightning was the same as electricity, and indeed we could. And once this paper was published, two things happened. There was great buzz in the philosophical discussions of not only the colonies, but also in Great Britain. My eventual dear friend, William Strahan, the Scotsman who was a member of Parliament and a printer himself, published our simple findings, and they were translated into Russian, into French, into German, and even as far away as Cathay, as China. My name was known in China. Now this And they made some improvements, but really they found our guesses and naming the thing, a battery, positive and negative, and other such things, and the fact that the point worked better than a blunt needle, etc. All these things fell to in establishing my character and reputation. In my time, the word character is not something that I have, it's something that you have for me. You have a good friend there in Galat. His character you hold. And when somebody asks you, who is this friend of yours? How you recommend him establishes his character. I'm assuming it's a good one. They're not laughing. You have work to do. Buy more drinks, obviously. And so this was able to establish two things. One, the scientific community was abuzz with this new type of information and experiment. The other thing that it did was establish me as a heretic, perchance an antichrist of sorts, because I was stepping between man and God, because I was preventing God from taking the lives of the sinners with the lightning bolts that God preferred. Ridiculous! God has no problem in ending anyone's lives and has proven so throughout all of humanity. In matter of fact, probably much, much longer than that. God has no need of lightning to kill us. But we have the right to determine how we control nature. And so it actually provided a schism between thoughts in the world. And indeed, it began to be thought that perchance man does have the right to self-determination. This fit right into the later parts of the Renaissance, and especially into the Enlightenment, the work of Locke and Hume, Condorcet, and other great thinkers, Voltaire, about what right we have to stand up for ourselves and say, I will not be part of this life under a vengeful deity, but rather establish for myself how I shall practice. And it actually eventually became to be fairly much more easy to establish the truth of it. If there are two ships at harbor, and one has a lightning rod on it, which feeds down, because if the lightning rod is one part, it must be grounded to be effective. So you have one ship at harbor with a lightning rod on it and grounding down into the water. And the other ship does not have one, and they're both struck by lightning. Why, in the morning, both ships are there. One is whole, one is nothing but splinters. And people begin to be convinced that perchance I'll risk offending God, but I want my warehouse. I want my house, I want my ship to survive such things. And it gradually began to, as I said, be parsed about the world, that this experiment, with my name on it, printed by my friend William Strahan, began to be known. And I was eventually awarded the Copley Medal, which is like your Nobel Prize. In Philadelphia, and I was accepted into the Royal Society of England. And so when it came time that the colonies wanted a representative in England to try and convince the court of St. James to let us please have more autonomy, let us be able to make our own manufacture rather than sending and paying for our raw materials to go to England and there to be manufactured, and then we have to be buying it back with taxes and import and all the travel fees. Let us simply make our own things. Let us run our own lives. We will be faithful and loyal to England, to Britain, and to the king. But let us govern ourselves under the rules of our monarchy. And Parliament was not seeing it that way, especially the Penns, who ran in Pennsylvania and did not have to pay taxes on any of their vast estates. And so I was sent there because my name was known. Certainly not Adams, certainly not Jefferson, the young boy at that point, if he was even born by that point. I was so much older than he. But we were sent, I and the papers and some other delegates, were sent to England. And there I set up in Craven Street, near the Court of St. James. Oddly, as I understand it, it is still standing, that house. It is still decorated as it was when I lived there, and you may go visit it. It is the only house in the entire place. So wherever I live, that still stands. And so Mrs. Stevenson was my host, became somewhat of my European wife. Not to the full degree, but simply host and constant companion where we went to theater together. So, and her young daughter, Polly, was also very attentive and who I gave many scientific lessons to. And we rubbed on very, very peaceably. My wife, Deborah, after giving me 2 more children, Francis, as I mentioned, who died at the age of 4 of smallpox. Oh, my heart still bleeds over that. And Sarah called Sally, our daughter, who was a very good and dutiful child. But I left, but Deborah did not wish to go, even though I asked her to. She never left Philadelphia in her entire life, even when the British took it over. She feared the sea. And so I spent most of our 44 years, a good half of it anyway, apart from her. But there I was for a good many years in England, trying to be an agent for the colonies, trying to keep the China of Oz that I mentioned together. It was so beautiful, so much potential. We knew from the Cook's, the Captain Cook's voyages, how broad this continent was. 3,000 miles close to. We knew because of reckoning and the longitude and stuff which had been established long before. We did not know what was in the interior. That would take another generation to discover there for ourselves. But we knew that we had almost unlimited growth potential. Great Britain was stagnating. They're an island, if you hadn't noticed, and could barely have more population. But here we were doubling our population every handful of years. And so all the future of Great Britain lay for us. All we had to do was negotiate with the native populations and to begin the laborious work of dealing with the slave populations. Something which, with great chagrin, I mentioned that I partook of when I was young. It was done. It was as average as having chickens in your backyard. They just were. My slaves were Jemima and her husband Peter. Bought a slave for my son. In the definition of irony, that slave's name was King. It was later in my life, which I'll interject now, that I recognized the error of that errata and became an abolitionist, but sadly not for many, many years. It was in that time in England that I ran afoul of the Penns, who would not accept what I thought a reasonable thing of a small tax on all their vast lands. And there are other things fomenting as well. There was what we call the Boston Tea Party, and of course the Boston Massacre, as it was publicized, and the running of the blockades of Mr. John Hancock, who you may recognize from his flourished signature on certain documents. He was quite the blockade runner, smuggler, I think is the less polite term. And people were so angry with the impossible taxes, the unbearable taxes, the Townshend Acts, and such as the Stamp Acts and the taxes on tea, etc. And the fomenting of rebellion against them began to be blamed to me. And I thought that I could prove that Hutchison, then, who was governor of Pennsylvania, was to blame, and he was asking for more troops and such. And so I printed, was able to actually released improperly letters of his that were given to me in private and to be held just to show people. And I let them out of my hand with promise that they would not be reprinted. They were reprinted, sent to America. They were found out, and the reputation was going to be blamed to someone else. And so I stood up and said, it was me that did it. It was me that released those letters. And I was called into the court of St. James. And it was there in what's called the cockpit, which was literally a place like bull baiting and such in Shakespeare's time. They used to have cockfights. It was directly underneath Parliament. And it was there I was called to court for that. And Lord Wedderburn lambasted me, excoriated me and my reputation and my character for a solid hour. If I objected at all, I would have been held in contempt. And so I had to stand there for an hour, listening to him berate me and causing all of the troubles, he said, all of the troubles of the colonies were placed on my head. The vase was cracking, and I could not do anything to stop it. I spent 70 years of my life as a loyal British subject. Long live the King! I drank toasts to, I printed praises to. As I mentioned earlier, Franklin family legacy was long free and the eldest son practiced the art of blacksmithery. As you know, probably, even in your advanced time, when you transmute iron ore, first into iron, then to wrought iron, and then eventually with enough heat and pounding into steel, it cannot go back. It cannot go back. That heat and that pounding drives out impurities and lets leave the purest aspect of that ore. In that hour of excoriation, I was heated and I was pounded. And as that vase began to shatter, something rose up out of it. I walked into that cockpit, a loyal British subject. And at the end, I was transmuted into something very different. An American. At the end, when Lord Wedderburn began to leave, I stopped him and said, "For this, I shall make your king a small man for this." And I left and I did the very unmanly thing when I returned to Mrs. Stevenson's. And I cried. I cried for the loss of that beautiful china vase. I cried for the loss of stupidity, of all that work and worth, of people willing to serve England, just not unfair parliamentary laws. To let ourselves guide ourselves. We were no longer children of Britain. We were the adults of Britain and of Germany and of France. We were the melting pot, I think your term is. And that industry was being stifled. I lost. I failed. I could only pick up a few of the larger shards and eventually went back to England. I thought a person personifying the greatest loser. A disappointment to my friends, a disappointment to the colonies. But when I arrived, there were bells ringing, and there were cannon shot, not fired at us simply for the noise. And I was elected into this Second Continental Congress that I'd heard only whispers of before, at what you now call Independence Hall. And there, as the eldest member of that body, I was able to hold on to a position of some importance as Mr. Jefferson crafted his declaration. So they could all agree to something about what they should say. Now, mind you, a declaration is a little better than a 14-year-old going, "I declare I am an independent person and I'm going to leave now." I would leave further, but my mother does not give me permission to cross the street. So I will stand here and hold my breath. That is what a declaration is. There is no legal standing to it. There's nothing more than just simply words. But what words they are. Mr. Jefferson, who I got to know at this conference, is quite felicitous with his pen. I've never met a man who could write so clearly. I can write humorously. I can write pointedly. But he could write beautifully. And he brought together thoughts of so many different generations, from Cincinnatus and Seneca and Epictetus to Locke and Hume and to the modern writers and thinkers, bringing it all into a marvelous document. He wrote, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. That all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." I thought actually that the term sacred and undeniable was a bit too much of the pulpit. We wanted to have a separation, you see. And so I recommended that we hold these truths to be self-evident, was a bit tighter of a phrase. It's also iambic pentameter for you Shakespeare friends out there. And it is with that this declaration was born. Now, it might be interesting for you to know that on July the 2nd, Mr. Adams wrote, "This is the day that shall be remembered forever. A day of celebrations and illuminations, fireworks, speeches and parades and picnics, hallowed throughout all time future." Because that was the date that the declaration was voted on and accepted. On the 4th, they printed it, was only signed by two people, Mr. Charles Thompson, the secretary, a man of great nobility and good thought, and of course, the great flourisher, Mr. John Hancock. A full, I think, a quarter of us who signed it was later in the summer and into the fall. And a full quarter of those people who signed were new delegates, other delegates not wanting to put their name onto a death warrant. And after I signed in the late summer, fall, it was decided that we needed help from a foreign country. Why, of course? The country that we had recently been at war with, which helped start the huge tax debt, which started the tea tax and the paper tax and the Stamp Act, etc. That war, we were now seeking to become our friends. A monarchy held with ancient positions of wealth and responsibility to the very few and grinding their population to powder. Yes, please help us overthrow a king because we are tired of abuse. And I was sent there to negotiate that. Why? Because I had toured there, I talked there, and my paperworks and my printings were known. And so they thought that my glib nature and my ability to play chess and deal with things and my flirtatious nature with the ladies there might be able to persuade the ministers, their wives, and their mistresses to be able to support our cause. Oh, good, my lady. It is oftentimes said that I was a woman chaser or an abuser of women. Let me tell you the truth. By that time in my life, I had gout. If you've ever known somebody with gout, you know that reputations can easily outstrip the actual physical ability to walk on a path or down a garden or down Cupid's lane. But one flirted. In fact, they liked my rough French. Je parle français très mal. I spoke French very badly. But most of the ladies of Paris enjoyed my crude way of talking because it was much purer as opposed to courtly flourishes. But I was asked once, why at my advanced age, for I was well into my 70s by this point, why at my advanced age women found me so attractive? The room got very quiet. The young man was leaning forward. He said, the one thing that I do that attracts every woman to me is I listen to them and act upon their advice. This endeared me to the French, especially the ladies, the wives, and the mistresses. I got to know Madame Brillon, Madame Helvetius, who ran salons in Paris, and got to sit there with the elite of the time. One of Madame Brillon's songs you heard earlier this very evening. And it was there that I played a very dangerous game of chess, balancing and trading, pleading. Beaumarchais, the great playwright who wrote the play Marriage of Figaro, he gave us money. Lafayette, the brave soldier, by his own finances, financed ships, men, armament, and risked his own blood in the service of George Washington. Hundreds came to our cause. And though I risked myself somewhat, if I had been caught on the seas, or if indeed the assassins who came for me while I was in Paris had succeeded, my life would have been over. But it was worth the risk. I broke so many vases in my time. My good wife, Deborah, after 44 years, died when I was in England in 1774. She did not even know that a revolution was going to be happening. And so, though I tried to flirt and gain affection, it was mostly to gain the affection of their time and intelligence. And it was that was able to bring about some degree of amity with France. And they eventually risked their reputation, their standing in war with England, to back us. It is said that Washington did not win that many battles, and he did not. Chance others of his generals were better strategists than he, and possibly so. Colonel Greene, Colonel Knox, Benedict Arnold won more battles than Washington before he decided to return to his former employment. I put my signature upon the Declaration, upon the Treaty of Amity with France, thanks to Vergennes and King and Queen Marie Antoinette. I put my name on the Treaty of Paris, sealing, at least for a while, the fact that England would accept us as a new country. And we began to build if not a repaired vase, a new piece of pottery, something maybe cruder, but something that we hoped would stand and last and be able to be passed down to generations, knowing full well that every generation following us would change the founding documents that we were establishing. All these things could never rebuild that precious vase. My son could not be brought back. My Deborah could not be brought back. All the friends that I had seen and spoken of at the funerals could not be brought back. The brave souls who gave their lives for what they believed in on both sides eventually had to have grass grow over their graves, and we had to move on. And eventually, at the very end of my life, I saw the Constitution passed. I saw the first and only truly democratic election, perchance, in the country's history. Everyone wanted General George Washington to be the first president. And it is there that, with my skin slack in my shrunken frame, I finally, my lungs filling up with fluid, pleurisy, gout, I passed away at the age of 84. And now they find out that you finally found a use for electricity. Congratulations. A simple use, a simple gift. I never patented any of my inventions. Not because I was a bad businessman, because really they were just ideas. Ideas to share. Ideas to make your life better, I hope. I'm often marked at how much of nature we are. We are wild sometimes like the sea. We are stout and strong like a tree. We are unforgiving as a mountain. We are as gentle as a pond. And we sometimes, too often, are much like wolves. We bark and bite and chase off our fellows for fear that we'll lose what little food we have. And I sometimes wonder if we might not be better if we indeed were more humane. We humans. If that may be yet achieved in your time of strife and toil, if anything that I've ever invented or said or done, written, may be of use to you today, I pray, make use of it. I am an old rag to be put to any purpose. For I am now, as I have ever been, your most ardent and humble and obedient servant, Benjamin Franklin. Most kind. Good crew needs to go back. I would like to give a thanks to Caveat Theatre and all the crew here. I would also to thank the lovely, wonderful, and talented Eleanor Stallcop-Horrox and Mark Japanowski, who did the piano rendition that you heard. And to each of you, thank you for making this much less of a lonely night. I thank you very much. If I may be of service, but call.
Thank you.
And it was that I began writing articles criticizing Harvard as being a great manufacturer of men who had no use whatsoever except to be able to walk into a room very well, be able to stand and point, and to be able to dance. But other than that, they were nothing but more than blockheads.